Hey, everybody. Um, let's see where to start. I guess we should start with this company that I found at Grant Boulevard in 2017, which was very much so about so much of what Keenan just mentioned, this idea of thinking about in design, really for me, really intentionally. I just finished watching Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th. I don't know how many of you guys have seen it, but if you haven't seen 13th, it's on Netflix still. You can find it on YouTube. And I really think it should be essentially required reading as we think about really examining the longer narrative arc, which is ultimately our shared history as people who live on this continent. For those of you who live on this continent, as to where we are in terms of our systems design, thinking about like our institutions and the designs of our institutions and the design of our neighborhoods, right, of lived shared space. So in 13th, Ava DuVernay, she sets up the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Specifically, she really does a great job of elucidating how that compromise, which eventually we know, most of us know it as the Emancipation Proclamation, which in one lens aspired to free these, all of these hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. It only worked because Abraham Lincoln's compromise made it so that local municipalities, boroughs, townships, cities, states could have the power to redefine how criminality would take place and how they could use that as essentially a design mechanism for recapturing labor loss as a result of his compromise with his constituents in the North. Really interesting thing. I did not actually realize until about 2 weeks ago, and this is I've been studying teaching history for years, how, where the actual Mason-Dixon line was. And my own notioning, my imaginings of America, I always thought it somehow meandered through, maybe Southern Virginia, and then maybe it went down and through Georgia. And I didn't really realize until 2 weeks ago that it was Pennsylvania, Bedford, Pennsylvania, right? We have Delaware was a slave holding state, Maryland. And so, when I watched 13th, it changed for me the altitude which I saw systems design. I grew up in Milwaukee, on the north side of Milwaukee, which is where pretty much 98.4% of Blacks in Milwaukee live on the north side. It continues to be one of the most racially segregated, cities in America. And as a Black girl on the north side of Milwaukee, I could already see the ways in which my community was different from other communities. I was one of the first kids to be a part of the charter school journey for America. I went with Chapter 220 from my urban middle school to a suburban high school, Whitefish Bay, which was, an incredibly affluent suburb of Milwaukee. And so I already had this kind of emerging understanding that where you live made a difference in your outcomes. That was in my lived experience. And in fact, that was such a painful one. I ended up transferring back to my neighborhood school where there was a daycare, right? A public school system that was countering at the time the highest teen pregnancy rates. And there were metal detectors, which we balk at now, despite the sharp rise in school shootings, which was very normalized for us Black kids living on the north side. So when I saw Ava DuVernay's 13th, what it really helped me to understand is it reminded me that there were all of those people that I loved and that I know who have experienced convictions as a result of this systems design that really get permanently locked out of pathways to just self-sufficiency, right? Which is a thing that we are as a country, we're all struggling with, is figuring out, just given the constraints that are all of the economic fallouts of this moment, how are we going to survive? But if you're Black, the statistical outcomes for what that will mean for you, particularly if you're Black, if you're Latinx in certain parts of the country, they're remarkably harsh. It's a remarkably harsh landscape to navigate. And so in my growing just recognition of that and recognition of all the people who I've loved who have been incarcerated, who I love now, who are currently incarcerated, I started thinking about how could I create something that would offer some opportunities, some safe opportunities, a soft landing space after a period of incarceration. And it really was inspired by film, right? Ultimately, it was by the design of a documentary. And so I started thinking about how that would look for me. I had been a classroom teacher teaching about disenfranchisement in the American story at that point for about 15 years. I've been teaching about colonialism. And I decided that education was just not going to be the way that I was going to make that happen. So I started thinking about where were those other places where muses showed up in my life. And oftentimes it was in in my closet and how I've been curating garments in my closet, how I've been thinking about fashion design, textile, color story, movement through fashion design, through style. And so I started studying the fashion industry. And what I saw in studying that fashion, studying that other apparatus, was how toxic it was on the planet. And so I really felt conflicted. And it really wasn't even so much of a what to do. It was like, how am I going to do this? It was, how was I going to create jobs for folks without regard for criminal conviction, being particularly sensitive to what those industries are like in terms of like points of absorption for women, in a way that didn't compound environmental damage. And I landed on 4 years ago now, sustainable design, which when I first started Grant Boulevard, I gotta say, quite honestly, I felt like I was met with some reluctance. People said, you're doing too much. You're doing a little bit of this, and you're doing a little bit of that. Like, what's your focus? What are you doing? And it wasn't until maybe even 3 years ago, I think there's been a broader thinking about design and the importance of intersectionality in design, which I think now makes company structure, benefit corporation structure much more warm, even consumer sentiment warmer to this idea that what we need in this moment more than anything are the emergence of like thinking, of critical design that brings together solution finding, understanding that the problems that we're facing, in terms of like the precipice of the climate and issues of justice, and equity and inclusion, those terms that we hear about all the time, that they actually are very intersectional. And so that's what Grant Boulevard has always aspired to do, specifically. And forming this company, it's been, how do we bring people together from diverse perspectives and build a warm community of people who are already standing very firm in their clarity around the state of the environment and their own personal values around the need to be centering more compassionate care of each other, recognizing that we also would like to receive some compassionate, tender care in ways that manifest themselves in well-designed, quality constructed garments that are sustainably sourced. And we do that through really just thinking about every piece of our design process, from, really having some incredible strategic nonprofit supports in the city, working with the Sankofa Healing Center, which works with women who are formerly incarcerated to help us with our hiring. Working with the Department of Corrections, moving in before the pandemic, I was able to go into halfway houses and recruit rather intentionally within halfway houses directly, going into maximum security prisons just to be in community and to listen with deference for people whose life experiences have not been my own. And ironically, they're very much so just really quickly becoming my own. My nephew, who just turned 19, is facing almost 30 years for some really just tragic choices. And that has nothing to do with his intellect or his potential. He was gifted as a little kid, and he just got caught up in a lot of hopelessness, which is ultimately what I think a lot of poor kids, particularly if they're Black and male, don't have the tools to figure out how to counter. And so they get absorbed by these other complicated machines that we as an American culture really don't have the mechanisms to figure out how to combat in more thoughtful ways, or we don't have the commitment to do what it needs to do to invest in giving them all the supports that would lead them to the kinds of outcomes that kids in other neighborhoods get, that they come to expect. And so we are thinking about, how do we use design, fashion design, from a place of from the ground up, right? So this isn't a retrofit fashion solution. From the day one, we've always been committed first to upcycling, which is, we call it the remix. As a Black girl who grew up listening to my mom's Miles Davis and John Coltrane, and then in my own 90s experience, really loving Diddy and the remix, that other tradition of taking things and mashing them up. We thought about, how could we reimagine menswear as a zero waste approach to fashion design? So that's been a cornerstone of what Grant Boulevard does, is, taking vintage pieces, taking menswear, and giving them, being really thoughtful about how we're curating those fabrics, and then ever more thoughtful about how we're reimagining them. And then in other approaches, using dead stock, which are overages from large companies that really have very little accountability in terms of how they're thinking about waste. And so they're overproducing all the time, to try to create a ferocious consumer appetite for fashion without concern for what the implications of that are on the natural world. So we've been thinking about how do we partner with or companies like FabScrab, a nonprofit it's a nonprofit with like a for-profit arm out of Brooklyn, who's moving into Philadelphia, which is super exciting, to figure out how do we reduce some of that dead stock waste, and how do we, extend again, just this effort to figure out how do we give folks, particularly folks who come from BIPOC communities, some new access points, to sustainable fashion. When we talk about sustainable design, oftentimes it's centered with the people who are wealthy, like it's this forward thinking kind of design intentionality, where it's like, if you can think about the future, then there's a space for you in conversations about sustainability. And I think for a lot of Black folk in particular, where there's been still so much persistent struggle to figure out how to navigate everything that this longer history of 300 years of enslavement has meant to our communities, it's been increasingly hard to think about the future. And so we've really tried to figure out, how do we approach sustainable design, our packaging, our content, on our social media channels, our event series, to really centering ever more inclusive folks in conversations about what is the state of our planet and what's the future of that, and in ways that feel really intersectional. So I'm going to be here, but my computer is going to die. And so I'm just going to take 2 seconds to grab my charger.
I think a pause is good, because Kimberly has already given us so much to think about. So I appreciate a little pause.
And she's back. Hey, y'all. All right. So yeah, so that's kind of like what we've been playing with in this journey to build this company. How do we bring together these strategic nonprofit partners that understand issues that have, in ways, they've been a part of my personal, just lived experience, but not from an altitude in which I've understood them. For the first time, my nephew was he was arrested, and he's incarcerated at the moment. And I had I've been advocating for criminal justice reform and systems change, and how do we end mass incarceration, from lobbying in Harrisburg to spending time with people who were juveniles like him, who committed really violent crimes, and listening to them talk with people who are the victims of crimes from other families, just in these really powerful moments of human exchange around the learnings that happen, and the reasons why they committed these, why they made these decisions as kids. And for the first time, I had to download the app, which gives you access to someone who's incarcerated. And I'm realizing that there's a felt experience beyond the cognitive one to what these systems does to people. And I think that we have an opportunity, all of us, in our work, to figure out, how do we encourage the apparatuses with which we show up, to be thinking with ever more kind of just bold intentionality about how do we do better at understanding that our ecosystems are connected, and that ultimately the solutions that we need, they will lie in design. Everything that is around us. And I think this came up in what we were observing about the things that we think are our favorite designs. Everything we're interacting with all day long it's always about design. And there are those things, those physical things that we can see, that I think are manifestations of design thinking. And then there are these other larger institutional forces, from how our schools are designed, how our classroom spaces are designed, how our neighborhoods are designed, our park systems are designed, which are all ultimately really ripe for a reimagining that continues to raise the bar for how there's just a mindfulness for the history, right? And this, when I say history, it's like there's like the pressing, overarching things that have been in place for a long time, and the persistence of these systems to try to maintain the things, the status quo, to try to maintain privileged senses of safety and access. And as I've built this company and been thinking about how we as a design concept are aspiring to being really thoughtful, I also recognize that that's something that we all have the potential to do. Bill from San Diego mentioned this idea of packaging, and I'd be remiss to say that that's not also something that we consider, right? Our packaging for us, it's it's always compostable. So that's something that we're thinking about. And even when we're still participating in these systems, right? We have to ship goods. We have a brick and mortar in West Philly, and actually in University City District, which also came up in some of the earlier intro comments, on 36th and Lancaster. So we do have a reimagined car garage. So that's there. But when we think about our shipping, it's even like, how are we reducing packaging? Like, do we need to add, the thing that people, I think we like to see, which maybe is a little extra tissue paper or maybe a little sticker that makes things look a little more, I don't know if the word is like it gives us a sense of status, but it's waste. And so, like that is something that those are shifts that we as consumers have to be making inwardly as well. So, it's a lot of work. Design thinking is a lot about education. And it's a lot about, for me as a leader in the space, it's a lot about how are we modeling just a real thoughtfulness across our supply chain, from how we are doing our sourcing to how we're doing our packaging, to how we're doing our hiring. When people come, we don't ask them about what their criminal history is. There's no box to check. There's no conversation to have, but we do ask people in the very first interview, do they understand our principles as a company? And that while we're not asking anyone to disclose their history of conviction, are they comfortable with other people who may have a history of conviction, and they will never necessarily know it. It may come up as we build community, but it's not a cornerstone of how we ask people to reveal themselves to us. We just want them to know that this is where we stand on it, and we want to be a safe space for everybody. So our team is diverse in lots of ways. All women, as it were, and women is however everyone wants to define women. There's not one way for us that we're even thinking about how to define women. That's not I had defined it for myself, and we have a team of people who define it for themselves, and that's good. And so, that's what we've been building over at Grant Boulevard. This real kind of, I hope, a warmth around recognizing the longer story of our country and the challenges that we're facing as a human race, as a species, to figure out how do we preserve our finite resources. And hopefully for us, it's to change culture. We want more and more people, to really feel like when they look at Grant Boulevard, when they think about our design aesthetic, when they think about our mission as a company, that we're doing the work, and we're working with the constraints that sustainable, ethical design imposes on us. And those are realities too. And so that's not to say there aren't challenges. There's so many challenges. Cultivating diverse community presents challenges, and making sure that your team has a living wage when you're a small company, that's a challenge. And then on top of that, really thinking about how do we work without a sense of like endless voracious production and endless waste, so but we're doing it. We've been doing it for several years now, and in part because I do think that, we as Americans, as consumers, we have a growing awareness of the work to do. And it's really been I think it's been an honor of my life to have had this muse come to me and to work with me and sit with me and stay with me, to help build this community of both customers and a team of people who find a great bit of personal joy. I know for a fact in the work that we're doing together to resist, because that's ultimately what we're using design to do. We're using design to resist. So if you haven't already checked out our website and you want to get to know the team as just like we got the incredible book that I can't read about. I added it to about the canoe. I added it to my list that came up earlier. But, if you go to our website and about us and our team, we've got some, like you can see us, like I left the room one day and said, it was actually the video you'll see is what we produced for a closed circuit TV channel for a work release program, so that they could let folks know when they're leaving and coming back into, just coming back home, if Philadelphia's home, that we're here and who we are and what we care about and what we look like and how our voices sound, so that you'll get a sense of our story. But so much of that story has been about resistance and about that idea of just pursuing, using our time and our talents to create a personal legacy that says that we see what's up, we know what's up, and we're not standing for it. We're not standing for it. So I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So Laura, do we have some time for questions?
We sure do. Thank you so much. I love the idea of design as resistance, and in particular, thinking about things that were designed in the beginning in the chat. We were talking about things that we consume, that we put in our body, or spaces that we are in with our body. And clothes are such an intimate item that we put on our body and that define our identity. So I just love. I love thinking about that in terms of design as resistance. And we do have a question in the chat, which is about your name, Grant Boulevard. How did it come?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to answer that. I wanted to say, just getting back to what you said, Laura, and then I'll totally tell you guys the story of Grant Boulevard. I think about the ways in which we are so intentionally disconnected, just as a result of, like, in part, it's not just globalization, y'all. It's really like it's an extension of colonialism, that we are really disconnected from the ways in which colonialism continues to dominate, just like the global supply chain. And so when we think about, what are we wearing? And this is a really hard one, because, we live in a society where our time is so tight, and we have to really oftentimes center, or we feel we have to center convenience as our driving value sometimes over how we're making our investments. But, if you really, and this is another thing you all should, if you're just looking for like extra, like kind of like we in Louisiana, I went to school at LSU. It's called Lanyap. It's like extra things. The True Cost of Fashion is a documentary. If you haven't seen it, it's about systems design. I mean, it's about fashion design, but in ways it's really about the larger kind of system of the industry. And I think that, once we really get a sense for how, all of the toxins that go into the colors that we enjoy, and how that percolates down into an individual, a village, and the implications on the natural environment for a village of people, I think that the pursuit of changing our habits lies in us really being more thoughtful about how we're understanding systems. And I think that that requires a time commitment, because it's like, this is self-directed learning, which I think for a lot of us, even our schooling has not really encouraged us to really pursue learning in that way. So I think, and we are all designers in this space, so, or aspiring designers. So I think our learning curve we're probably a little bit more open to that idea of learning. But watch The True Cost of Fashion, because I think when we know who's making our clothes, it'll help us know the importance of wearing our values. And we just actually at Grant Boulevard, I saw another question in the chat. There's 6 folks in the studio space, which is in the Crane Arts building in Northern Liberties. We just added some new design labels, some new care labels, where it's like sustainably sourced, handmade. And I intentionally designed a label where there's a space for the sewist to write her name. And so I think that that's another part of like using packaging, like using that idea of design to tell a story. And so that's something else that I'm super proud of that. Like, I've been thinking about it for like a really long time. And this was just the moment where I was like, we are stepping it up, level up, y'all. Sign your names, let folks know that who you are, and take some, and that's another level of pride, in terms of being makers. When people receive something and you put a personal stamp on it, it's not just something that you made and sent out. Design has to also should be about, I think, it has to be about a sense of human connection. I mean, otherwise, the reduction to our lived experience as like a global community, it stays shattered. It stays shattered. It doesn't become shattered. It stays shattered. So the story of Grant Boulevard is the story of a house. I grew up, my parents were postal workers. They met at college, first generation college attendees. My mom is from Philly, from South Philly. My dad is from Milwaukee. He's the descendant of Great Migration folks from Mississippi. And they met at college, fell in love. And Grant Boulevard is the first house that they purchased together. And in that house, for the first half of my childhood, my parents were both active in resisting in different ways. My father in that house, he resisted publicly. Well, I guess it started actually with a private journey. He resisted privately by growing a lot of what we ate. So, we were super in that way. We were super unusual. My parents were the first on either of their families to own a home. And they got a plot in this upper middle class section of the north side of Milwaukee. And my dad we had like cherry trees, and we had rhubarb and blackberries. And so, it was a really super unusual experience in that way. And then when publicly he opened a business on MLK Drive, which I mean, if you really look at the designs of MLK Drives, they typically run through America's poorest neighborhoods. Like they sit in the heart of poverty. And so he opened up a business adjacent to a KFC, aspiring to offer a healthier food option for folks who, you know, just that's the food desert. It's like there's just a food desert. And so that was what's happening to my dad. And my mom, when she wasn't working at the post office, she was there. And when she wasn't working at the post office and wasn't volunteering at the business, she was volunteering in a women's correctional facility to Cheetah. So those were things that like we talked about until I was about 13, when my mom fell into a really deep, super deep depression. And she decided that the best place for her to be was away from us. So she moved about, maybe a mile away, and I saw her maybe twice between the time I was 14 and 18. She couldn't stay. And so she left, and my dad couldn't stay for different reasons. He fell into a cocaine addiction, like just self-medicating the collapse of his family. And so I've been on my own since I was 14. And that house on Grant Boulevard, it taught me a lot about survival. More than it taught me a lot about systems and about the work of being, what it means to be an activist in your lived experience, just from the model of my parents, and being there with them and learning from them and being in spaces with them. And then when they were gone, it taught me a lot about the ways in which people who don't have parents and people who don't have resources make the best choices they can. You know, we have a notion of like, you make bad choices or good choices. I think oftentimes people are just making the best choices they can. And there were choices that I was presented with that included, am I going to use my body as capital? Is that going to be my way to survive? That I don't know I would understand in the ways that I do had I not had that other experience on the Grant Boulevard. So, you know, when I started Grant Boulevard, I was thinking about the totality of that. I didn't think about having to really settle into a new sense of acceptance about what was ultimately a lot of trauma. But I think that it's interesting how radical vulnerability leads to radical self-acceptance. And that's, for me, has led to a lot of healing. So that's the story of Grant Boulevard.
Great story, Kimberly. Thank you for sharing all of that with us in such an open way. I feel like I've traveled down Grant Boulevard with you and come out the other side in a wonderful place. Another question that's come in is fashion sustainability something you go to school for or get hands-on and intern?
You know, it is an emerging emerging space in university campuses. So, you know, Drexel has a program in sustainable design broadly, but they don't have a focus in sustainable fashion design. Though Beth Quinn she's teaching there, she's our director of impact, and she is, you know, challenging her students to think about that. Columbia is working on like an emerging professional degree. Fingers crossed they'll hire me to teach there in sustainable design, so sustainable fashion design specifically. So it's an emerging thing. You know, Thomas Jefferson University here in the city, they have a master's degree in sustainable design, but it doesn't really focus on the industry so much. So it's a gap that I think universities are trying to figure out, how do they close that gap, because, you know, Gen Z is not planned. There's a lot of, I mean, don't get me wrong, their spending doesn't quite align with their values. You know, though the thrifting market is one of the fastest sectors of the fashion industry right now. But they have a lot more, as the youth always do, they have a lot more excitement and passion and anger and outrage about the state of things. And so I do think it's something that universities are trying to figure out, how do they offer something that helps them to navigate how they're going to approach design for themselves. So, yeah.
I have a question. Is there anybody for you in the fashion or design industry that you see as kind of a leading light, or who is also doing what you're doing in a way that you'd like us to be aware of? And then I see JD has a question, so we'll go to you next, JD.
You know, my very first mentor in fashion design, specifically sustainable fashion design, circular design, was Tara St. James, is Tara St. James, and she remains, now she's she's become a dear friend of mine. Tara St. James was working at Pratt, a Brooklyn fashion, and then they're the Brooklyn, like they had a fashion design accelerator. She was working there. She had a brand for a long time called Study. Now she's working on a new project in circular design. circular fashion design specifically, which is something that she's been thinking about for a very long time, probably about 15 years now. And she's just zooming in. She's a hyper focus on what that needs to look like. So Tara St. James is one of those people who I think she has a really robust understanding of what is the what. And then in terms of like another brand that I really love how they're talking about the things is Tonelay. And Tonelay, Rachel Fowler is the founder of Tonelay, and she's a white woman she's very deferential, and she's a great communicator. She's an incredibly thoughtful person. So Rachel Fowler is another one of those people who I think about as being who's doing some really remarkable work in that way.
Thanks, Kimberly. JD, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Awesome. Thank you so much for everything you said, Kimberly. Like, really great story, fascinating. Like, didn't know about your brand truthfully until today, and like now I'm like sold and already a dedicated follower. So thank you for coming and speaking with us. I was just curious, like, why Philly? Why did you decide to lay down roots here?
That's another story, JD, as it were. I met my ex-husband in Louisiana, and he's from Camden, New Jersey. And so when we were finishing up undergrad, well, I was finishing up my PhD, he wanted to come back to the East Coast. And, my grandmother was here. She's still here. My grandmother will be 94 in a bit. And she's still kicking it, taking selfies. And so when he said he wanted to resettle in back in Philly, I was pretty much game. And now I have a 13-year-old. And so I'm going to be here for a while. And actually, of all the places I've been, I think I'm close to like 30 countries. Philly is one of my favorite cities for a lot of reasons. One of it is I think it does have some real meaningful integration. I think that in terms of its politics, the city goes beyond just being liberal. And I think there are a lot of people who are aspiring to what might be some progressive reimaginings of the future. And that is super exciting to me. And, we have a long history of textile manufacturing in Philadelphia. So there is an interesting irony that we find ourselves, aspiring to, really develop our flagship approach, which is something we hope to replicate. Like we're trying to gear up to figuring out how do we make some changes in our business model so we can build a box that we can replicate in other cities that have a similar need, which is pretty much every city, where there's like, thinking about, American manufacturing, thinking about inclusive hiring. So yeah, that's how I got to Philly, and that's why I'm going to be here for, I think pretty much the long haul, JD.
All right.
That is great to hear. Hollis, go ahead.
I just wanted to actually use my voice instead of putting it in the chat. Just thank you. Thank you seriously for sharing. So inspired about what you're doing. I, again, was looking at your website, and I used to work at Belmont Charter, right on, 40th and Belmont. So yeah, very familiar with the area. And I love your passion. I love your thinking. I thank you for sharing your story. And I was the one who asked about the sustainability. My daughter she's passionate about, like, she loves fashion. She's like, what is going on with this planet? Like, so that's why I don't always know if school's the answer. Like, I truly believe in the actual hands-on and like diving in and meeting people and being in a space in order to truly understand it, not just go to school for it, kind of thing, and then get out and be like, I don't know if I even like this. But not so much a question necessarily, but I just appreciate everything that you're doing. We will be visiting your space, and thank you.
I really hope I get to meet you in real life, Hollis. And that's a global invitation for all of you to come through and say hello. And I agree with you, Hollis. I don't know that, it's interesting. I'm in the process right now of launching an online course series called Build It Boldly, which is all about like, how do we move outside of the traditional university structure as the mechanism for learning, in part because it's cost prohibitive. And secondly, because it's oftentimes, and I have a PhD, right? So I've paid my dues in that space. I feel like oftentimes what we get are not actually accessed. We get a lot of theorists, and my degree actually is in theory and design, but we get a lot of theorists and not necessarily practitioners. And so I think that there is something to be said about figuring out how do we, those of us who know, and this is a part of privilege, right? But how do we get the young people that we love, and in our own quest to be better designers, how do we put ourselves in closer proximity to people whose design thinking and design strategy aligns with something that leaves us feeling inspired? Ultimately, what I would love for your daughter to find is a pathway that empowers her to figure out what will be her solution, right? Like that. Well, she gets clearer and clearer on, this is what I think is my sense of purpose, and this is how I would like to, how to bird that sense of, how to manifest that through this interesting asexual kind of creative process. And that is a birthing, to gestate an idea and to birth an idea. And I think that that's one of those things that can't be taught. It can be fostered ultimately through personal relationship and through community.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Well, first of all, a request for you to do an autobiography one day.
I'm not going to lie. When I was listening to in the beginning, I was like, to the beautiful story of the man who built the canoes, I was like, yeah. I think I want to write a book.
Yeah, I think you should. In
my free time, Laura.
In your free time. All right. Thank you for putting Build It Boldly in the chat. And the question is about how friendly is Philadelphia in terms of being a place for startups? What's the startup culture here like, and how's that been for you?
And that is a real question. It is, I think that actually it's a very friendly place for startups depending on your sector. I think if you're really interested in biotech, I think if you're really interested in, tech is that's just like a global phenomenon where we've been seduced by tech, which is such an interesting thing to have, to be seduced by something that is actually non-human is just, it fascinates me. Like in the juxtaposition of that, like the reality of it is just, it's really, I think it's an interesting concept for all of us to kind of figure out, like, this is crazy that we're being seduced by the most unhuman thing, but whatever. So I think if you're in that space, it's good. I think if you're in the food space, I think Philadelphia is a really great place to show up to, because we Philadelphians, we love a good food adventure. I think when it comes to fashion design, it's a tough space, because I think what's proliferated the landscape for us in terms of our options are just big box brands. And so we don't really have a lot of small ateliers, like that small maker studio space is just not something that we have. And I think in part it's because it is expensive. Like fashion in general, it's not that it has to be expensive. It's just that the expense has to be paid by someone. Like, this is the reality. Like, it doesn't matter if whether we perceive it on our end as a consumer as expensive or not, it costs something to someone. So if we're intent on saying we only want to spend, what Urban Outfitter offers as an example, a $20, $30, like that, if $20 is our target for whatever that thing is, we're just pushing off the cost, right? We're just pushing it down we're literally just we're just pushing it off to a colonized people. And so I think that that's been the challenge for consumers and for us as a brand. We really aspire to offer a few different price points, because I want working class people to be able to participate in sustainable fashion. And that's a part of the bold experiment that is a part of our journey. I will say that we've gotten support from Beyonce, which was super helpful during the pandemic. We've gotten support from the NAACP. We've gotten support from some really unusual sources, and I think that that's helped us to just survive the pandemic kind of generally. As we look forward, for us, it's how do we find, really it's for us, and this is for any business that seeks to just essentially scale. Like, we want to build a B Corp that is scalable. It's how do we find investors that really are committed to a couple of things, that believe in Black women, that believe in women in leadership roles, that believe in Black women in leadership roles, that believe in measuring return on investment in ways outside of an immediate, and these immediate cash returns is just the only way of measuring what makes a business successful. And that's a unique subset of investors. And so, I think that's oftentimes a struggle for startups in general, is like getting your fit right in terms of who believes in what you have to offer. And that's the next stage of our journey.
Great, because once you become an invested company, you have to pay attention to those investors' priorities. So yeah, I hope you find the right investors for you. And I see that Natalie has a question, and I'll ask you to unmute yourself in just a second, but I want to interject with an anecdote, which is that I was lucky to travel to New Zealand in 2006. And I always like to visit a thrift shop when I'm someplace new. And I came to find out that they don't have thrift shops in New Zealand because they don't do fast fashion there. It's an island nation. everything is super expensive, and the things that are made there are expensive and high quality, and they just, use it up till you can't use it anymore, or they mend it, or they upcycle, or reuse it. And that was a real eye opener to me, in terms of the throwaway fashion. All right, Natalie, go ahead.
Hi, I'm so happy that I clicked on this and caught maybe the last 30 minutes or so. So super excited, went on the website and just love it. So I'm just excited to be kind of introduced to all that you're doing. I caught the tail end of you talking about the felt experience versus the cognitive experience. It sounds like with maybe a family member who is in the criminal justice system. And I was just wondering if you could talk maybe about, just briefly, it might be a bigger, longer talk, but going from that felt experience to the cognitive experience and what could be done differently from a design thinking perspective, looking at things differently, if that makes sense at all.
I think it does, Natalie, but I want to just ask a clarifying question. You mean in terms of like the justice, like the criminal system? Like what could be done differently in the design of the criminal system?
Well, yes, because you said I caught the tail end, so I missed a piece of it. But what struck me is that a lot of people have a cognitive awareness that things have to change. And that's different than the felt experience when you're going through it, with a family member. And it's things that we don't really talk about, that when the family members are going through it and trying to support and all of that. I know that design thinking is looking at things differently and thinking outside the box. And I'm just wondering if you had, even though you're kind of fashion and sustainable fashion, I'm just wondering if you saw any kind of things there that immediately kind of popped up.
Natalie, I'm still processing it, in truth. It's like I saw my nephew for the last time in November of 2020, and I had a real long talk with him. I had an intuition that he was just like trying to be, kind of like cut corners, and he thought he was just, he's an excellent chess player. And I thought that at that time he was 18. I thought at 18 that he was like, that he was just, I got an intuition that he just thought he was just like, could just do what he kind of wanted to do. And I had a long talk with him in the store, in the shop, in our brick and mortar. We had just a private one-on-one dinner, and just kind of like, what's going on with you? I'm worried about you. And he was like, Auntie, I got it. It's cool. I got it, Auntie. I got it. And then he was arrested 3 months later for some who are you? Like, what happened? And yeah, he just got caught up in a gang like that. That was really just got caught up in a gang and just got up with so I think as adults, it's hard for us to remember the intensity of peer pressure that we experience as kids, and how ill prepared our brains are to help us in making wise decisions, and how arrogant we can be. And I think that for a lot of juveniles who are this is anyone under 26, when our brains are not fully developed, we don't really have a cultural compass for having compassion for particularly Black males. I mean, I've been teaching in a suburb where my kids are predominantly white. I mean, like 90% predominantly white for the almost the entirety of my teaching career. And the attitudes about, boys will be boys and they're just learning, and kids are making this, there's a lot of gentleness about egregious behavior that Black kids just don't get. And so I don't even know if I have words yet, Natalie, but beyond just capturing that, I know in myself that in my somatic experience, that despite all of the academic kind of scholarly research I've done into our criminal system, reading Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete, looking at, James Baldwin's commentary on the ways in which Black folk have been incarcerated, both inside of prisons and outside of prisons. I physically didn't know nausea. I physically didn't know anxiety. I knew sadness. I knew frustration. I knew outrage. I had a feeling of of deep betrayal by this nation of being a patriot, and like one, like the idea of America. But I didn't have the physical experience of like And Natalie, I don't even know I can't even call him yet. This is just you and I just talking. I can't even, I call my sister and I'm like, I'm really struggling just to even see him in a prison. I can't, I'm not ready for it yet. And then those are things that I had not even imagined other people were processing, because I just couldn't imagine it. This is the things you can't imagine until life tells you. It's not even an imagine. I mean, like now, yeah, it's been wild. It's been really, 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 really wild.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a lot. So thank you
You're
for
welcome.
sharing.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more questions. And one that is in the chat is asking about, is there anything that the city of Philadelphia can do better to support small businesses like yours? Is there
Yeah, and
anything
that
you
is a
wish the
design
city
question.
could do?
Yeah, that is a design question. Thank you for that question, Rosemary. I think that I think that there are a couple of things the cities can do, and I'm gonna tell you that I'm gonna just do a little I don't know, I'm just gonna do a disclosure that that oftentimes my thinking, it is not counter to what we've been conditioned to think is what we should expect. And I think that's because what we've been conditioned to expect doesn't just do enough of the meaningful disruption that meaningful change actually requires. And this is what I mean by that. I mean that when we look at let's look specifically at Black business owners in Philadelphia as one micro, one example. You know, 2.5% of businesses in Philadelphia are owned by Black folk. Like that's, the city has a 40% of the city's population is Black, and only 2.5% of businesses are owned by Black folk. And of that 2.5%, there's only 1% of them that employ people, like that have more than one employee, right? Where it's not like I am in business for myself. So I think that, and so that's one thing. I'm just gonna put that out there as to why there's an impetus for Rosemary's question, that this is the impetus, right? The math says this is why we need to think differently. One of the things that continues to, it's a point of frustration for me. And so we, as a business owner, we lease our studio space and we lease our storefront. Our storefront was a dusty car garage in the middle of a block with very little commercial activity. I mean, some commercial activity, but not that much. It wasn't like a built out commercial district when we moved in on 36th and Lancaster. We have added so much value to the space simply because the owner never conceived of it as a commercial space, right? So now here we are, we've added all this value, we don't own the space, and we can be evicted at any time, which essentially means that we are ultimately, I mean, it can be said that we're sharecroppers, that we're paying back on something that we won't own, and it doesn't add to it's not an asset that belongs to us. And I think that one of the things that the city needs to do, and this is about equity. This is about long-term ownership, which, you know, if we look at the work of this, his name is escaping me, but this Harvard economist did this study that said if you held white wealth constant, it would take Blacks 300 years to get to the point of equaling white wealth. And that's a daunting kind of reality that we have to work with, but I don't think we have to accept it. And I think one of the acts of resistance that cities like Philadelphia and San Diego can do is there has to be a different level of like supporting ownership for Black businesses, so that we are not at we're not always beholden to leases that we can never, we're just like essentially kind of always struggling with the state of like homelessness. Like, we love this space in West Philly. If he decides that he wants to raise the rents by 15%, that will put us out of business. And that has nothing to do with, you know, our business model or our work ethic or our design aesthetic. It's just the dollars, it's just economics. So I think the city needs to be thinking more radically, and radical in the sense of how I'm defining it is meaning like pulling something out from the root, like you're weeding a garden, you are pulling that weed out so that it cannot continue to come to propagate again. It needs to be more radical in terms of yanking out old structures and ways of thinking to actually empower business owners from historically, intentionally disenfranchised groups from ever being able to participate with a sense of empowered ownership in the way that so many other business owners are able to. And that doesn't mean that, like, you know, like the struggle for other small businesses that are owned by white companies or white folks who own businesses, that there are not similar struggles, that there are not struggles. It's not saying any of that. This is like a, okay, I can love all plants and still recognize that cacti have special needs, right? And so that's what I think we need to be thinking about as we think about what are we even asking people who we elect. We want an equitable society, because having an equitable society means that we all experience equity. And when society is not equitable for all of us, it's actually not equitable for any of us. It's just a matter of what changes in the circumstances where your floor falls from beneath you. And I think that the city can be doing some more of that kind of really bold envisioning of a new city landscape that encourages Black businesses to actually be anchors in communities and not transients. I know that's a lot, y'all.
Powerful, wonderful, thank you. Well, we've had quite a morning, and everything from the carceral state to sustainable fashion, the racial wealth gap, economic justice and injustice. It's just been a wonderful talk and a wonderful Q&A, and I know everybody joins me in thanking you for your voice, for your vulnerability, for your honesty. If people would like to connect with you or check out what you're doing with the podcast and the course and your company, what's the best way for folks to stay caught up with you?
I'm going to put all of those handles in the chat, so you can find me at Grant Boulevard. You can keep up with our journey there. If you're interested in just following my personal journey and whatever comes of that, that's my handle. I do have a podcast that I just love this podcast. It's co-hosted with a dear sister friend of mine, a white woman who's also a PhD. And we talk about, it's called The School for Disruptors. And we talk about, every episode is guided by a word. Our last word was tribe, and thinking about how do we curate tribes that make us feel empowered. How do we do that careful editing of who we bring into our inner rings and who we choose to kind of push away. So that The School for Disruptors is a podcast that you can follow us on. And then I put Build It Boldly in the chat. If you own a business, or you're thinking about starting a business, or you work for a business and you're like, how do we reimagine how we're thinking about design with a deeper sense of intentionality, then Build It Boldly is a great way to just kind of get a sense of my perspective, what I've learned about that blueprint. So it's very much so design strategy. There's like online courses that set up, how do you think about purpose? What's the shared language that we need in terms of thinking about equity and justice and disenfranchisement, so that we can build things with a real clear lexicon for what we're centering. And then it gets into like, these are the elements of thinking about sustainability. This is how we center people. This is how we think about people in terms of like our internal teams versus the global supply chain people. So it's all of that kind of like breaking down, how do we approach design strategy with a much more kind of radical and brave and bold, right? I'm just like, how do we meet that longing to just resist?
All right, and we have to do it together.
We absolutely have to do it together. In every space, we have to do it. In our home spaces, our neighborhood spaces, our work spaces, our play spaces. I always think of activism as a lifestyle. And I think that we oftentimes, because of the narrative of what it means to be an activist, there are people who have been policed and people who have been, punished, that some of us have a reluctance to see ourselves that way. But we can all disrupt, and we can all make sure that in our lifestyles that we're thinking about, what is our legacy, and how does our legacy align with really showing up in the directions that make us feel proud.
Well, let's go do it.
Let's go do it, y'all. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Thank you so much, Kimberly. And thank you everyone for joining and asking great questions and participating. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.